Hello everybody, my name is Henrik Bogdan and I'm a professor of religious studies at the University of Gothenburg here in Sweden. And I would like to start by thanking the Quatuor Coronati Lodge for the invitation to present a paper at your lodge, and especially the worshipful master Andreas Önnefors. The title of my paper is The Esotericism of the Esoteric School of Quatuor Coronati Lodge. And I am going to simply read this paper, as I've been asked to do. And the structure of this paper is simply divided into three parts. And in the first part, I'm introducing the topic, the Esoteric School of Masonic Research. And in the second part, I'm going to discuss the esotericism of this approach to Masonic history and look at the methodology and the topics that these scholars were writing about. And finally, in the third part, I'm going to discuss the importance of this approach to Masonic history or Masonic research from the perspective of the study of Western esotericism. So this is the basic structure of this paper. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint while I'm speaking. Some images and all the quotes that I'm going to read out. There are quite a few quotes which I think are important to in order to understand the arguments of some of these scholars. So let's share this PowerPoint. Okay. The notion of an esoteric school of Masonic research was made popular through John Hamill's introductory book on the history of English Freemasonry, The Craft, published in 1986. While discussing different approaches and interpretations of the origins of Freemasonry, Hamill argued that there are two main approaches to Masonic history, the authentic and the non-authentic. The first approach is supposedly based on verifiable facts and documentation, whereas the other seeks to place Freemasonry in the context of an esoteric tradition, often referred to as the mystery tradition. While the authentic approach antedates the founding of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge in 1886, this scholarly methodology has come to represent the work of QC from its earliest days to the present. The formation of QC and its authentic or objective approach to Masonic history is to a large extent reflective of contemporary trends in late 19th century academia, with its emphasis on a critical and text-oriented analysis of historical events and processes. More specifically, the early representatives of the authentic school concerned themselves primarily with two aspects of Masonic research: the question of origins and the access to source materials. The answer to the former question was believed to lie in the transition from operative to speculative Masonry, while the latter concerned the identification and subsequent publication of early manuscripts and documents, such as the old charges of medieval stone masons. The quest for origins and the emphasis on the importance of source materials was not a unique feature for Masonic scholars, but was to be found in contemporary historical disciplines, such as the emergent study of comparative religion, which was increasingly being emancipated from theology towards the end of the 19th century. It is with the works of Masonic historians such as W.J. Hugen and the Reverend A.F.A. Woodford that the authentic school can be considered as firmly established. Hugen and Woodford not only published critical editions of important historical documents, and thus inspired generations to come of Masonic authors to base their research on reliable sources, but they also collaborated with other Masonic authors on important historical works, such as Gould's highly influential The History of Freemasonry, published between 1882 and 1887, which contributed to place Masonic research on a firm scholarly foundation. Significantly enough, it was this group of colleagues who in 1886 founded Quatuor Coronati Lodge. The non-authentic school, on the other hand, is described by Hamill as divided into 4 categories, which all share what we might call a perennial understanding of Freemasonry. We shall return to perennialism and the ancient wisdom narrative subsequently, and the incapability of separating subjective interpretations from objective facts. As we shall see, the division of the non-authentic school into esoteric, mystical, symbolist, and romantic categories is problematic from the perspective of current scholarly definitions of Western esotericism. But for now, it is worth noting that the esoteric school of Masonic research is, according to Hamill, not only characterized by a particular understanding of the origins, history, and purpose of Freemasonry, but that the research of this school is flawed from a methodological perspective. The, quote, inability to distinguish between historical fact and legend, end of quote. When discussing the esoteric school more specifically, Hamill described its methodology as being comparative in nature, with John Yarker as the most representative example of this particular school. And I quote Hamill here. Viewing Freemasonry in all its diverse branches as a coherent initiatory rite, which it is not, the esoteric school compares it with other initiatory rites, finds similarities, actual or imposed, and assumes an intercommunication. John Yarker is probably the major figure in this school. His magnum opus, The Arcane Schools, is a monument to misapplied scholarship. It reveals not only the breadth of his reading, but also his inability to digest, or in some cases understand, what he has read. End of quote. Summarizing the Arcane Schools as a monument to misapplied scholarship and dismissing researchers like Yarker for their apparent inability to distinguish between historical fact and legend might be a bit too harsh. And in all fairness to Hamill, it should be pointed out that he later seems to have softened his critical stance, at least in terms of Yarker. In his 1996 AQC paper, John Yarker, Masonic Charlatan, ? Hamill states that not only was Yarker's, quote, belief in the development from operative to speculative Freemasonry in accord with the thinking of Masonic scholars of his day, earning him praise from W.J. Jugend, but also that in the Arcane Schools he did what we in this lodge would expect, provided references for every statement he made, and was always careful to distinguish between evidence and his own speculations, end of quote. His weakness as a scholar was that, like all self-educated men, he had enormous but uncritical respect for the written and printed word. The distinguishing feature, then, between the authentic and the esoteric schools of Masonic research in terms of methodology is the emphasis by the esoteric school on a comparative study of Freemasonry with a wide range of non-Masonic traditions and currents, such as Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, and alchemy. The basic premise for this comparative approach is the notion that similarities between two systems indicate some sort of historical link or a common pattern, and that it is possible to gain a deeper understanding of Freemasonry through a study of kindred systems. The supposed benefits of this comparative approach to Freemasonry were spelled out by another shining light of the esoteric school, William Wynne Westcott, in his 1893 inaugural address as Worshipful Master of Quatuor Coronati Lodge. And I quote Westcott. He wrote, "No one can for a moment fail to acknowledge the ardor with which the Lodge has carried on the historical branch of our studies, and I am quite prepared to grant that every line of history so gained has a definite and distinctive value in building up a complete fabric of the life of history of Freemasonry. My only personal feeling is that a very hard and fast adherence to history and a tendency to slur over the hidden mysteries of nature and science, which we are pledged to study, might possibly, if the policy became extreme, be worthy of criticism, if not condemnation, from a Masonic point of view. And he continues, if I have any influence with this lodge, and it can only be for a short time, it will be then in the direction of drawing your attention to the mystical rather than the material, to the allegorical rather than historical aspects. My feelings then, brethren, only prompt me to encourage among you the tendency to greater study of symbolism and the analogies between each Masonic point and similar reference in other arcane societies and institutions. Or at least, my brethren, let us recognize that the complete thread of occult thought runs through our rituals, and until they be emasculated from such positive evidences of mysticism, no master can be wrong who encourages study and research in these most interesting sidelights of Freemasonry. In discussing Westcott's comparative approach to Masonic research, Era Gilbert remarks in connection to Westcott's 1894 paper, Rosicrucians, The History and Aim, that Westcott, quote, epitomizes the approach of the esoteric school, his contention being that in the absence of documentary evidence, it is quite legitimate to draw historical conclusions from textual analysis of Masonic ritual. If the symbol is present both in the Kabbalah and in Masonry, ergo, there is a necessary connection between the two, and the early speculative Masons must also have been Kabbalists, end of quote. Westcott's criticism in his inaugural address of a strictly historical study of Freemasonry was grounded in his belief that such a study would result in a disenchantment of Freemasonry. And I quote Westcott again. After all, brethren, life is not all too rosy an existence, and we should try to avoid destroying the halo of romance and beauty which surrounds any branch of it. To me, it seems that outsiders come into our ranks because our order offers a vision of old world romance, a flavor of mysticism, a possibility of magic. And of quote, in short, it was more beneficent, according to Westcott, to study Freemasonry's philosophy and mystic shrine than its history and the charter rolls of the country. It is thus worth noting that Westcott, in his inaugural address, did not criticize the methodology of the scientific or historical researchers. The distinction between the authentic and non-authentic schools had, of course, not been made yet, but rather the topics to be studied. Understanding the symbolism, philosophy, and rituals of Freemasonry was more important to Westcott than presenting mere historical facts. However, in emphasizing the importance of such subjects, he did not stand alone. In fact, in his oration at the consecration of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, delivered on January 12, 1886, A.F.A. Woodford proclaimed, and I quote, "For in truth, we may find ourselves in our needful researches among primeval mysteries. We may have to go to far Aryan sources. We may navigate the mystic symbolism of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We lose ourselves amid hieratic papyri, or we may sound as far as can the remains of the Aporeta of Greece and Rome. Some of us have made our incursions into Scandinavian sagas. Others have explored Teutonic mythology, and others have lingered amid the communities of Greece and the Collegia Opificum of Rome." Continues. Masonic students have to consider in their survey of the Masonic records of the past the accretions of early ages and the peculiar aspect of coloring of medieval tendencies. Hermeticism has an attraction for some. The usages and organization of the craft guilds affect others. In fact, no one can successfully treat the diversified outcome of all these various lines of thought and study, of rational witnesses of Masonic history, without paying attention to many apparently conflicting and yet probably coherent testimonies, all converging to one point, all witnessing to one true source of origin and development. If often contrasted, still ever parallel, coexistent, and synchronous, end of quote. Considering that Woodford is usually regarded as one of the founders of the authentic school, the final point in the above quote is quite remarkable, i.e., the notion that there exists one true source of origin and development to all those various synchronous traditions that the Masonic students have to consider. In fact, this very much sounds like one of the main characteristics of the esoteric school as described by Hamill. What role did the esoteric approach to the study of Freemasonry play in the early days of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge? Judging by Westcott's critique in his inaugural address of the subject matters preferred by the adherents of what would become known as the authentic school, it is possible to surmise that historical discourse dominated the work of the Lodge, at least in the eyes of Westcott. Still, according to Gilbert, up until 1916, a substantial number of papers were published in AQC that might be labeled as esoteric. In fact, Anthony Baker claims that almost 25% of all papers published in the period 1886 to 1900 can be labeled as symbolic or interpretive, which Baker argues represents the work of the esoteric school. Before moving on to the next part of this paper, let us make a brief recap of the esoteric school of Masonic research thus far. 1. Hammond's claim that the esoteric school, as part of the non-authentic school, is characterized by an inability to separate fact from fiction can be questioned. Authors such as Yark and Westcott adhere to the same basic principles of scholarship as representatives of the authentic school, i.e., referencing and making use of prime sources. 2. The main difference between the two schools, in terms of methodology, was the comparative approach favored by the esoteric school. And 3. The comparative method was dependent on the belief that Freemasonry was either linked to or consisted of an ancient wisdom tradition that has taken many different forms throughout the ages. And 4th, the representatives of the esoteric school therefore favored a different set of subjects for their research. For example, the symbolism, rituals, and philosophy of Freemasonry and associated traditions. But in what way was this esoteric? Or phrased a bit differently, what was the esotericism of the esoteric school all about? In his description of the esoteric school, John Hamill singled out John Yarker and his work, The Arcane Schools, as the main representative of this particular type of Masonic research. Although Yarker became a member of the Correspondence Circle of Quatuor Coronati Lodge as early as 1887, never became a full member of the Lodge. This did not stop him, however, from supporting and taking an active part in the Lodge's work, and he published no less than 26 papers and extended notes in AQC. The Arcane Schools can be seen as the culmination of Yarker's lifelong interest in the history of Freemasonry, but the basic premises for this work, that modern-day Freemasonry is the custodian and transmitter of an ancient wisdom tradition, and that high grades of Freemasonry are as old as the craft degrees, can be found already in his first book on the history of Freemasonry, called Notes on the Scientific and Religious Mysteries of Antiquity, published almost 40 years earlier in 1872. In this work, Yarker argues that, quote, there was in existence amongst all the civilized nations of antiquity an exoteric form of religion and an esoteric interpretation. The one constituted the religious beliefs of the vulgar, and the other the sacred teachings of a philosophical association to which none but candidates prepared in mind and body were admitted. He continues to state that, again, quote, most notable of these mysterious fraternities were those of Mithras in Persia, of Isis and Osiris in Egypt, of the Kabire in Samothraki, of Brahm in India, of Bacchus or Dionysus in Syria, of Eleusis in Greece, of the Druids in Britain, of Balder in Scandinavia, of the Huitzilopochtli in America, etc., etc., etc. End of quote. The three etceteras at the end of the quote cover a bewildering array of religious, mystical, and philosophical traditions, which Jarque claimed to share an esoteric understanding of the, quote, contest between good and evil and the death and resurrection of some mythic personage, end of quote. As far as antiquity is concerned, Jarque states that it is to Egypt that we must look for the most complete development of every branch of this sublime and mysterious association, end of quote. Now, it is perhaps telling that Jarque to a large extent focuses on the outer forms of the traditions that he discusses, such as the myths, ritual, and initiatory structures, rather than what is supposed to be the common doctrines or teachings. The main argument seems to be that all the various systems he discusses are mere manifestations of one and the same tradition. This underlying ancient tradition has, furthermore, been kept alive throughout the ages and can be found in Freemasonry today. While the identity of doctrine which Jarque sought to discover can be found, allegedly, across the globe, he paid special attention to what he termed Gnosticism in the Middle Ages, consisting primarily of alchemy, Kabbalah, and operative Masonry, and to modern Rosicrucianism, which covered 17th century esotericism, especially its reception in England. Although Jarque went to great length in trying to show that this ancient doctrine had been transmitted to Freemasonry, especially the high degrees, he would later claim that Freemasonry is by no means the sole preserver of this ancient tradition, nor is it only to be found in the West. In a lecture delivered at Grosvenor Hotel, Manchester in 1883 on the topic of speculative Freemasonry to a select audience of members of the ancient primitive rite of Freemasonry, Jarque stated that the chief existing branches of today transmitted from ancient times are the African mysteries, the Lebanon Druses and Ain Sareh, the Chinese Triad and the Japanese Celestial Brotherhood, the Hindu temple mysteries and the Bektash, and other Devish sect mysteries of Turkey, Persia, and Egypt. For almost 40 years, Jarque relentlessly continued to argue for the existence of an ancient wisdom tradition, and that Freemasonry was the custodian of this tradition. But his involvement with so-called irregular or fringe Masonic high-grade rites seems to have alienated him from mainstream Freemasons, and he was often met with criticism or silence. For instance, the great American Masonic authority at the time, Albert Pike, dismissed him as an, quote, inaccurate historian, end of quote. Judging by his preface to the arcane schools, by the end of his life, Jarque had resigned to the fact that the more conservative strands of Freemasonry would not be convinced by his work. And he wrote, "Those who obstinately deny the existence of anything which is outside their own comprehension are fully as credulous as those who accept everything without discrimination. There are certain intellects which lack intuition and the ability to take in and assimilate abstruse truths, just as much as there are people who are colorblind or deaf to more delicate notes of music. This was well known to the ancient theologians and mystics, and the reasons which they assigned for the mental incapacity will appear in the following pages." Two years after Jarque had published Arcane Schools, the prolific and much more popular author Arthur Edward Waite published The Secret Tradition in Freemasonry in 1911. Hamill includes Waite in the non-authentic school, but places him in what he calls the symbolist rather than the esoteric subcategory. According to Hamill, the, quote, symbolist school seeks the origins of Freemasonry in a comparison and correlation of symbolism and ritual language, and tries to link in a lineal descent various religious cults, mysteries, and societies with Freemasonry, end of quote. It is a bit unclear, however, to what extent the two schools actually differ, since both share the same basic supposition that there is an ancient wisdom tradition underlying the majority of all initiatory traditions, including Freemasonry. This supposition is made clear in Waite's massive history of what he calls the secret tradition. Weight differs, however, from Yarker in three significant ways. First, the scope is much more limited in the terms of the traditions discussed. Whereas Yarker traces the wisdom tradition in a bewildering array of historical examples spanning vast geographical areas and historical periods, Weight focuses on an explicitly Western context. Weight does not deny the possibility of an Eastern reception of the sacred tradition, stating that, quote, it should be understood that there has been a great analogical transmission of the same subject through the channels of the Eastern world, end of quote, but the focus of the sacred tradition in Freemasonry is to all intents and purposes Western. Second, whereas Yarker tends to be unclear about the nature of the ancient wisdom tradition he seeks to trace in his works, Weight is explicit about the nature of the sacred tradition, which to him is an essentially Christian tradition, grounded in ancient Judaism, concerned with the doctrine of mystical death and rebirth, or to quote Waite's own definition of the sacred tradition. The sacred tradition contains, firstly, the memorials of a loss which has befallen humanity, and secondly, the records of a restitution in respect of that which was lost. For reasons which I do not propose to consider at the present stage, wrote Waite, the keepers of the tradition perpetuated it in secret by means of instituted mysteries and cryptic literature. End of quote. As I have discussed elsewhere, Waite argued that this tradition is preserved in the legend of the third degree, and he believed that the loss of the Master's word was connected to the Zoharic quest for the lost knowledge of how to pronounce the name of the Lord. And this brings us to the third major difference between Yarker and Waite. Yarker increasingly emphasized the significance of the high degrees, whereas Waite considered the third degree to be the most important ritual of Freemasonry, and that the only possible worth of high degrees was the extent to which they were linked to the sacred tradition as expounded in the legend of Hiram Abiff. Now, in order to fully understand the esoteric school of Masonic research, we need to place it in its proper context, i.e., at the intersection between the comparative study of religion and fin de siècle occultism. Towards the end of the 19th century, the emerging field of comparative religion was to a large extent concerned with the origins of religion. Influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, scholars such as Max Muller and Edward Burnett Tylor believed that religion had developed from earlier primitive forms of spirituality, such as animism, pre-animism, or magic. They believed that in order to understand the function and purpose of religion, one has to study the earliest phases of religion. Furthermore, they favored a comparative methodology through which they sought to discover patterns in religion that went beyond the confines of a single religious tradition. Pioneers of the comparative study of religion, such as Max Muller, argued that truth could be found in all great religions, if only one looked beyond the outer dogmas that are dependent on historical circumstances, and that it is by comparing religions that eternal truths will be revealed. This approach to religion can, for analytical purposes, be seen as an example of what historian of religions Ivan Strensky has identified as the quest for natural religion, which has its roots in the 16th century. According to Strensky, the crisis of the Reformation, which led to Christians fighting against Christians and thereby objectifying Protestants and Catholics, in combination with the crisis of the discovery of the New World, with encounter of indigenous culture and religions that differed radically from anything known in Europe, this led intellectuals to reflect upon the possible truths underlying all known religious traditions, truths that went beyond the outward dogmas of revealed religion. Thinkers like Jean Bogdan and Edward Lord Herbert of Chester believe that religion is an innate, built-in feature of being human. It is therefore natural in the sense that it is normal, that is a normal part of being human. Natural religion was thus not only seen as that which unites all great religions, but also as a natural part of being human. Adherents of natural religion often argue that God manifests through the rational aspect in man, as well as in the laws of nature, as shown in particular by the 18th century deists. Without going to the specific details here, Strensky argues that the quest for natural religion is the very foundation of 19th century comparative religion and the historical critical study of the Bible, and that scholars such as Max Muller and William Robertson Smith in different ways sought to identify the Urreligion, or natural religion, that dwells behind the word religions. Reading a book like Yarker's The Arcane Schools in the light of contemporary studies of comparative religion, his emphasis on the earliest forms of esoteric religion and the use of the comparative method becomes understandable. Also, the idea of finding an underlying truth or ancient wisdom tradition is to a certain extent in line with someone like Max Muller. The quest for an ancient wisdom or sacred tradition was not unique to the esoteric school, however. On the contrary, speculation about the possibility of discovering spiritual truths through a comparative study of religion flourished in esoteric milieux, especially within the theosophical circles. According to Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, all esoteric religions are but different branches of the same tree. And the closer you come to its stem, the closer you will be to the eternal truths. Blavatsky's spiritual project, as laid down in Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, consisted in recreating the perennial tradition that she claimed was the origin of the world's religions. To Blavatsky, the closest one could come to these ancient traditions were the Eastern religious traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, and it was therefore necessary to study these traditions in particular. The work of authors like Blavatsky, Yarker, and Waite can be understood from the perspective of what Dutch historian of esotericism, Wouter Hanegraaff, has termed ancient wisdom narrative. Hanegraaff argues that from the Renaissance onwards, although examples can be found in late antiquity as well, esoteric discourses are often based on genealogies of revealed wisdom. Such genealogies are linked to the construct of tradition, and they function as a link to history and thereby afford the present custodians or transmitters of the ancient wisdom with authority and legitimacy. By the end of the 15th century, intellectuals like Marsilio Ficino and Piccola de Mirandola tried to correlate newly discovered forms of ancient wisdom, such as the teachings of Corpus Hermeticum, with the Christian revelation. Hanegraaff divides the ancient wisdom narratives into three categories or ideal types that classified pagan wisdom as being either an ideal that contemporary Christianity should use as a model for reform, Prisca Theologia, an expression of universal truth, Philosophia Perennis, or an incomplete glimpse of the exceptional truth that would arrive with Christianity, Pia Philosophia. Yarker's ancient wisdom tradition and Waite's secret tradition can thus be seen as expressions of a grand narrative of ancient wisdom deeply embedded in Western esotericism. Yarker's quest for the identity of doctrine echoes the Renaissance Philosophia Perennis, with its belief that there exists a universal and eternal wisdom beyond the outward manifestations of individual traditions, while Waite's secret tradition seems to draw on both Philosophia Perennis and Pia Philosophia, with his belief that the ancient Jewish search for the lost way of pronouncing the name of the Lord is to be solved by union mystica with Christ, which Waite believed was the esoteric message of the third degree legend. What are we to make of the esoteric school then? Should it be seen as a mere curious footnote to the history of Freemasonry, or is there perhaps something significant about it which deserves to be studied in more detail? I would argue that the esoteric school of Coronati Lodge offers the scholar of Western esotericism an intriguing example of the crossover between esotericism and scholarship. As such, It is an important case study in the history of what eventually developed into the academic study of Western esotericism in the 1990s. When Antoine Febvre proposed his definition of Western esotericism as a form of thought in access to Western esotericism, he did it in large measure as a response to scholars who tended to confuse the study of esotericism with the propagation of esotericism. These scholars often approach esotericism as a universal and trans-historical phenomenon where the esoteric truths or essence remain the same throughout history and across the world. Furthermore, esotericism was often understood as a distinct tradition with a capital T, an unbroken tradition which has existed unchanged since times immemorial. On the continent, this notion was often influenced, directly or indirectly, by the French anti-modernist thinker René Guénon. As shown earlier, the esoteric school, to all intents and purposes, share this understanding of esotericism as an unbroken and trans-historical tradition, and it can therefore be seen as an early example of religionist or traditionalist approaches to the study of esotericism, as opposed to the historical critical approach favored by scholars such as Febvre and Hanegraaff. The second, and perhaps more important aspect about the esoteric school is the emphasis placed on Western esotericism. Although Yarker, and to a lesser extent Westcott, were interested in Eastern forms of esotericism, their main focus is unquestionably the West. This is even more true for someone like Waite, who almost exclusively focused on what he perceived as a Western secret tradition. The division of Eastern and Western forms of esotericism has been traced to late 19th century emic constructs of esotericism and the reaction against the Eastern emphasis of the Theosophical Society. Occult and initiatory societies like the Hermetic Society, Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn can be interpreted as manifestations of what historian of esotericism Justin Godwin has called the Hermetic reaction. The important thing about the esoteric school in this context is that the construct of a Western form of esotericism was presented in a scholarly context, with the attempt to adhere to scholarly principles, i.e. referencing and making use of prime sources and the use of a comparative methodology. As such, the esoteric school can be seen as the forerunner of the study of Western esotericism as we know it today. Thank you. And this is the end of my paper. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to all your questions, your comments, and your critique.